Peace. This is Jamal Robinson with 720astrology.com. Today's date is May 28th, 2024. At the time of recording this, it is 10:43 p.m. Central Standard Time. About 2 weeks ago, I initiated a new series on this channel titled The Astrology of Black People, 1987. I got a lot of feedback on that video, and a lot of people showed interest in seeing where this series would go next. As promised, I am coming before you now with the next installment, which is the astrology of Black people, Venus and Melanin. Now, I know I initiated this series with looking at a particular year, but as I said in that video, this is going to flow organically. So it's not going to be tied down to any set protocol. And in keeping with that, I was led to address this theme from the perspective of Venus and Melanin with this installment. I first want to say that I was inspired to do this series by listening to an interview by Karen Hughes, a well-known radio personality and internet personality, podcaster. She had an astrologer that I respect named Sam Reynolds. He's been an astrologer for, I think, at least about 30 years. Erudite gentleman, very well-versed in the language of astrology and just metaphysics and mysticism and religion. So she had him on, and this was probably maybe about 2 years ago. And he's talking about, I can't remember the exact title, but it was something around astrology and dealing with Black people. But he posited in this video that he thinks the planet Venus would more closely associate with Black people than the others. You know, it's been like 2 years since I watched this video, but it did stick with me. So, Mr. Reynolds, if you see this, please forgive me if I am misspeaking. But the gist that I remember of the video is that, again, Venus is associated with so-called Black people. And he went into some different explanations to support his position. And I remember listening to it, and I was fascinated with the presentation, just fascinated by just the thought process to even look at it that way. Because to me, it was very Aquarian. Now, he's a Scorpio, and he has Jupiter in Virgo, so you know he digs through things and combs through details. So I respect that, but I thought that was very Aquarian, the way he even approached this from looking at a planet being associated with a people. And I was inspired. I also felt like he may have held back, or maybe he was just trimming down for the sake of time, trying to make his presentation as concise as possible. I felt like he could have gone a lot deeper and that he had a lot more to say. And I could be wrong, but it's just what I felt. So that's one of the major inspirations for this series, a continuation of that from my perspective and my studies. I was also inspired by one of my favorite books by a well-known astrologer and researcher, Richard Tarnas. And this book is Cosmos and Psyche. I'm going to pull out a lot of stuff in this discussion. So in this book, what he does is he takes historical moments, pivotal historical moments, and he puts them up against an astrological backdrop. And you'll notice here on this channel, I attempt to do the same, as I mentioned in the video on Jupiter in Gemini, from teacher to student. I talked about how I think it's a game changer to utilize history side by side with astrology. If you want to get a very deep perspective about things that have happened, then you want to look at the astrology of these key moments. And then you are able to recognize patterns. And that's one of the biggest things about this book is it gives you insight into patterns that develop over time. And by looking at these synchronicities that show up with these patterns, you're able to understand how evolution is flowing, how humanity is being moved. You're looking at the development of thought processes and much more. It just gives you deeper insight into the life we've been living as a collective. So this book is definitely an inspiration. Another book that I think is a great addition to your library is Generations. Okay. The History of America's Future, 1584 to 2069. What this book does is it'll take a generation and it divides these generations into these groups. It'll have subcategories and then it'll show key figures that were born or who died during this generation. And this naturally ties in with astrology because it is giving you a window into cycles. And that's what astrology is, the study of cycles. So this is giving you a historical backdrop that you can juxtapose with the astrological. These two together are very valuable to have in your arsenal of understanding. What they lack, though, is a more direct viewpoint or insight into my story. And when I say my story, I'm talking about people who share the same hue, phenotype, ethnicity, nationality, if you will. It seems that in many cases, our impact on the great collective narrative seems to be an afterthought. And much of what we get seems to be from a position of reception and not of initiation. What do I mean? You study, first of all, I grew up being referred to as a minority. The root of the word minority is minor, which means child. So doomed etymologically to be categorized as a child. So things like that, it's a subconscious wound that is inflicted by language. And that language is not necessarily indicative of the nature of the people. So things that subtle, that simple. And when you're a minor, you are receiving, you are living on privilege, the privilege of being the parent's child. And so you live in reception and not initiation. And so when you're an afterthought in the historical lens, then one can take on this attitude of lesser than and will lose the full context of one's significance in the great continuum of human history, the human story, and personally. And so there's a need to balance the scales by knowing the complete truth. So the efforts here are not to make myself feel better about myself or good, or make you who may be watching, who may happen to be of a similar hue or melanated. That's ultimately not really my aim here, because I was fortunate to come from a home where my self-esteem was fostered early. But what I do intend is to present a perspective that I feel has been overlooked. And in doing so, through truth, not through emotion, through truth, to foster a greater sense of self-worth and to help the collective, all humanity, to be able to continue the evolutionary process, because we are in the midst of it. These are times that will be studied in the future, and these times will be remembered as a pivotal moment in the human time continuum, and we are living in it. So it's important that we get certain truths revealed and added to the ledger for the official record. In the 90s, a well-known astrologer named Robert Hand worked with two other gentlemen, and I think they all were named Robert. I can't remember. But I'm sure at least one of them was named Robert, other than Robert Hand. They set out on a project called Project Hindsight, and they were to recover Greek texts that were written in Latin, and translate them so they could recover lost literature, astrological literature around the traditional Hellenistic practice of astrology. When people, and it was a great effort. Let me say that. Great effort. There's a guy named Chris Brennan who has written a tome on Hellenistic astrology. I've learned a lot from him, and I got, I don't know, 3 or 4 of Robert Hand's books. But again, it's as if people who share my hue or phenotype didn't really have a real contribution in the formation of astrology. Now, I'm not blaming those gentlemen. They never actually said that or made that statement. But we got to understand how history has been presented. The Greece that we know of today, the Latin world, Rome that we know of today, has been presented as one that is European, it's Caucasian, and it is considered to be the fountainhead of Western philosophy, thought, jurisprudence, education. So this looking back to Greek is this longing for the beginning of Western society's dominance and prominence. But the thing about it is, historically, the landmass that, or the country of Greece, including Rome and Spain and the other Latin countries, historically, they come out of Etruscan, Phoenician, Canaanite, Canaan, Egyptian, which we could give an overall theme of African, if we want to use that term. That's just we're just going to use that as a catch-all term, because that's where all these others, the crossroad comes through. If that's the case, then it wouldn't make sense for me to be left out of the conversation when we're allotting the efforts of those early pioneers who gave us the science slash art of astrology. We're talking about a truth that hinders the entire world, whether heavily, deeply melanated or not. Truth is truth. And when truth is presented, it offers space for healing. So I offer this. This book came out in I think in the early 90s, late 80s, 87, Black Athena by Martin Banal. All right. 3-volume book or 3-volume set. And I mean, each one is a lot. This one's 500 and something pages, volume 1. Here's why this is important, because this scholar, who was a Canadian, I think he was a Canadian, he was a man of European descent. So we don't have to worry about it being someone who just wanted to write something to feel good about themselves. No, this is a man of European descent who decided to present evidence that the Greece we laud today actually emerges from an African bosom. I'm going to read a little bit from this book. And this is just from the introduction. The introduction is 50 pages. So, I mean, but we want to read a little bit. Black Athena is focused on Greek cultural borrowings from Egypt and the Levant in the 2nd millennium BC, or to be more precise, in the 1,000 years from 2100 to 1100 BC. Some of these may be earlier. The reasons for choosing this particular time span are, first, that this seems to have been the period in which Greek culture was formed, and secondly, that I have found it impossible to discover indications of any earlier borrowings, either from the Near East or from legendary cultic or etymological Greek evidence. The scheme I propose is that while there seems to have been more or less continuous Near Eastern influence on the Aegean, over this millennium, its intensity varied considerably at different periods. So he goes on and presents his thesis, and I won't bore you with going all into the details, but I just wanted to touch on this to show that there is ample scholarship to show that even if we're going to go with Greece as the fountainhead of Hellenistic astrology, and this being the traditional um, astrology, that it would not make sense to not include in the presentation the fact that it comes from melanated people. And someone left a comment and said, basically, in suggesting that race doesn't apply in astrology. And it's just always interesting that when there is a rebalancing of an imbalance, that then the rules come out, the goalpost is moved, basically suggesting that I'm taking the pure science and sullying it by introducing anything around race or ethnicity, or which is not the case. The case is, if the truth is told from the onset, then there's no need for me to even have these conversations. The North Node is in Aries, which one of the things the North Node in Aries does is focus our attention on self, on identity. Who am I? And I'm part of the generation with Chiron in Aries. My generation was labeled X, as in the unknown. So we come here with a wound around identity. And so this is an attempt to understand who I am better. And in doing so, for the world to understand what it is better, because you can't eradicate key pieces of world history and expect to have a world that is able to function at its highest potential when you don't have all the information. So, Black Athena, we're gonna lay this out piece by piece. In sociology, there are two theories that I want to touch on. One is called symbolic annihilation. And basically, when you want to symbolically annihilate a segment of society, you just don't include it. You don't mention it. It's that simple. And by in doing so, it is if there was no contribution and there was no actual existence of merit. Nothing worth. You didn't miss anything here. Nothing worth seeing here. That's symbolic annihilation. Some of these books, I have authors that are symbolically annihilated. How? Because they're not included in other scholars' bibliographies. That's what scholars do in the academy. They scratch each other's back. You know, I'm going to put you in my bibliography. You put me in yours. I'll write a forward for you. You'll write a blurb on the back of my. But when there's a scholar who bucks the status quo, goes against the status quo, bucks the system, they can be symbolically annihilated. So their work is never mentioned in anyone else's books. You don't see Martin Banal in many bibliographies. You're not going to see Alfred Boyd Kuhn in many bibliographies. You're not going to see Gerald Massey, even crazy as Aleister Crowley. There's another theory called the theory of self-concept, meaning if I tell my 6-year-old she's dumb as a box of rocks, then she will develop this idea that she's dumb. If I keep telling her that, then she will acquiesce to the message I have implanted. And that concept that I have implanted, it will become her identity, who she sees herself to be. Theory of self-concept. And so this is part of the wound when things are negated or left out of the historical index, and we can't even, we got to go and hunt and search, and then it helps to create this false identity that I ain't shit. I was a slave, or before that, I was a savage, and some good folk decided to set me free. And oh, but by the grace of God, that theory of self-concept. when the real history says differently. How can we have recognition of a great year, which is 25,920 years, makes a great astrological year? How could man determine that unless man was sitting still for at least 75,000 years to calculate it? Why do I say 75? 25,920 goes by one time. You got to see it twice to even remotely recognize that it was a cycle. That's just common sense. So that's 51,000 years to see it go by twice. Now you're scratching your head. But then the third time, and you see it happen again, and somebody's been sitting, taking some type of notes, some type of data to register what has happened. So my theory is man had to at least sit there for 75, 76,000 years to calculate this, which means the astrological tradition could not go back to just the second century BC, or I don't know when it's given as the origin of Babylonian. Some people want to argue Babylonian. Pick any of the names that you want to. None of them would date 75,000 years ago. I argue that the birth of astrology at least has to go back that far. And see, now we go against the Darwin theory of just these savages and evolving from monkeys and apes. And no, we're talking about people who were civilized hundreds of thousands of years ago and who sat around and studied their environment. And with that said, we now go into the astrology of Black people, Venus and melanin. So all of my videos connect with each other. Look back at the Taurus season video, the one about the unexpected ritual, and you see I mentioned that chain of energy from Hathor to Isis to Astarte to Inanna, Ishtar, then to Venus, and from Venus to Columbia, which is the Statue of Liberty. Statue of Liberty, representing the goddess Columbia, which is Venus, is made from copper. Now, what's significant about that? Copper is the metal that is governed by Venus. Let's look at some of the properties of copper. Remember, astrology is a symbolic language. Every clue is worthy to be investigated. If Venus is associated with copper, then that's giving you a clue about Venus's properties. Study copper, how copper is used. Copper, exceptional current carrying capacity, superior conductivity, less oxidating than other metals, which prevents corrosion, high thermal resistance, which prevents overheating and increases the lifespan of the wiring. This is copper. Coinciding with that, Venus, as the planet of connectivity and relationship, embodies the properties of copper. This is especially so given its association with the Ankh. Let's go to the whiteboard. So Ankh, also pronounced as the Ankh. That word Ankh, if you just look at the N-K, that means to join. And the Ankh, the K, can be also interchangeable with the G, okay? Ankh, Ankh, all right? And so whenever you see an N and a G together, they're also talking about knowledge. And knowledge is about fusion, joining things together that first were separated. That's when we have the SC words like science, schism. They deal with separation. So we separate things so we can eventually bring them back together with the Ankh to join. And ultimately, the separating and rejoining, that's the story of Set and Osiris. Set cuts up Osiris so he can be put back together, i.e., remembered, leads to knowledge. And the Anunnaki is the inspiration for the symbol that we use for Venus. Now, through her powers of connectivity and conductivity, Venus allows spirit to commingle with the 3D world. Read that again. Through her powers of connectivity and conductivity, like copper, Venus allows spirit to commingle with the 3D world. The title of this presentation is The Astrology of Black People, Venus, and Melanin. And what I have just described about Venus and copper coincides with melanin. Melanin allows spirit to commingle with the 3D world. Now, copper, keep that in mind, copper. As I said, I'm going to be bringing out a whole bunch of books in this presentation, and I want to show the actual stuff. So this is the American Dictionary of the English Language, Noah Webster, 1828. Everybody should have a copy of this particular dictionary. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn to the definition of American. All right, when you look up the definition of American in this dictionary, it says noun, a native of America, originally applied to the Aboriginals or copper-colored races, races plural, found here by the Europeans, but now applied to the descendants of Europeans born in America. This is coming from Noah Webster's American Dictionary of the English Language, 1828. Again, American, noun, a native of America, originally applied to the Aboriginals. That means from the original, Aboriginal, or copper-colored races. Venus rules copper, and we know what copper looks like. Now, I want to give a definition of melanin because we are juxtaposing Venus and melanin in this discussion. Melanin comes from the Indo-European root male 3. Let's go to the whiteboard. So melanin, this is the root it comes from. Roman numeral 3 is broken up into families, and it means dark colored, i.e. black. Now, but here's how I want to approach this, because this is still an astrological conversation. So this is what I did. I took this dictionary. I've got a 2-volume set. This is an unabridged, compact edition of the Oxford English Dictionary. All right. Copyright 1971. This is why I'm advocate, have you a library. So I'm not going to go through this big, heavy dictionary. I know for a fact I got this one on paper. So melanin, the black pigment in the retina, choroid, hair, epidermis, etc., of colored races of man or melanic varieties of animals. Also, the black pigment developed in certain diseases. Now, here's why this dictionary is important. Because I got another unabridged dictionary, but it does not do what this Oxford does. This Oxford is going to show you when the word is first introduced. The word first shows up in the English lexicon in 1843. Now, and it was with a lecturer who was talking about invertebrate animals. The secretion in the ink bag of a cephalopod is affirmed by some chemists to contain a peculiar animal principle, which Vizio has termed melanin. Here's the astrology. The reason, again, we look at historical events and we also want to look at what is going on in the heavens is because it gives us a full picture of these moments in time. So now what we're going to do is look at what was happening astrologically in 1843 when melanin first shows up in the English lexicon. The year begins with Saturn at 16 degrees of Capricorn, square Pluto at 19 of Aries. When Saturn and Pluto square each other, you have an immovable object, Saturn, because Saturn places limits. So it's like the walls. So it's an immovable object that is in a clash with an unstoppable force. And when those two are going against each other, it is a power struggle. It is a hunger for power. It is a hunger and a need to prove oneself. I wrote, I'm sticking to going off my notes here. This causing an extreme need to prove that I am who I say I am. Extreme ego consciousness and warring spirit. Around this time, the US is fighting to project itself as free and sovereign. With Capricorn on its second house cusp, and I'm talking about the US chart, and I'm going by the Symbolic chart. With Capricorn on the second house cusp, much of this compulsive expression involves finances. Additionally, Saturn is approaching the natal Pluto at 27 of Capricorn. So in other words, in the United States chart, Pluto is at 27 of Capricorn, which I'm sure you heard a lot about with the Pluto return. Well, around this time, 1843, with Saturn at 16 of Capricorn, it is approaching the natal Pluto in the US chart. So it's just 11 degrees away at this time. So not only in the transit chart is Saturn squaring Pluto, but in the US natal chart, Saturn is approaching the natal Pluto. So this further exacerbates this need to prove oneself and to have sovereignty financially. Self-worth is a second house thing. All right. And that aspect with Saturn approaching the natal Pluto in the US chart is partile. That means it's when it was actually perfect on January 13th and 14th of 1844. The intense pressure caused by Saturn squaring Pluto also directs attention to the darker, hidden processes of existence. There is great potential for malefic urges to harness, access, and control the darker polarities of the energetic spectrum. In other words, this is an occult revolution that is going on in the Western world at the time of this transit. So let's look at some things going on around this time. 1843. This is the time that William Miller, who was the founder of the Millerites, which we would come to know today as the Seventh-day Adventists, he predicts the end of the world to occur. He predicts that the world is going to end between 1843 and 1844. And these groups are still around today. Jehovah's Witness, Seventh-day Adventists, these groups were founded on people making failed prophecies. But either way, he prophesied falsely that the world was going to end between 1843 and 1844 because these people were astrologers. And he's basing that on this Saturn Pluto aspect, I think. 1844, Joseph Smith is murdered while in custody. He had Jupiter was conjunct Uranus at the time in Aries, violence. And it was received by Mars in Cancer, which was square Pluto, violence. So look, this is an eruptive time This is that compulsivity right now. 1840s. This is the time that the word melanin is introduced into the English lexicon. 1843, Noah Webster and Francis Scott Key both died in 1843. Both were integral in rewriting history and the attempt to send indigenous people to Liberia, Africa. See, this is another discussion we'll have about what's significant about the Francis Scott Key Bridge that fell in Baltimore. Noah Webster, the author of the dictionary I just read from, well, his brother, Daniel Webster, was it his brother or cousin? It might have been his cousin. No, it was either his brother or cousin. Daniel Webster, along with Francis Scott Key, were members of the American Colonization Society, which was started in 1816, the American Colonization Society. And their goal was to remove indigenous people and send them to Africa, to Liberia. Very interesting. But at this time, those two gentlemen are deceased. So again, 1843, the term melanin enters the English lexicon. At this time, there is an increasing awareness of the subtle forces beyond the 3D and within the human constitution that drive certain activities and modes of expression. In other words, this is an occult revolution in the West. What I'm trying to show you is how a word can emerge that matches the energy of the time. Pluto is squaring Saturn. So here we have controlling factions that look to further solidify their control by delving into the world of hidden matters. The West is percolating with an occult awakening at this time. You want to look at the movie Dark City. Look at the movie Dark City because I think it gives a great representation of the energy of this time. So I want to read something from a book titled Secret Brotherhoods. And this book is written by Rudolf Steiner. It's his collection of lectures. Quote, the second half of the 19th century was a very important time. In one circle of our friends or another, I have often pointed out that the year 1841 was a crisis year, a year of decision. This is not obvious if you look only at the necessary to see these in conjunction with what is going on in the spiritual world. Hear that? The year 1841 was indeed a critical year for the introduction of the materialistic age, because that is when a certain battle began in the spiritual world, a battle of certain spirits of darkness, one might call it, who belong to hierarchy of the angeloi. They fought this battle in the spiritual world until the autumn of 1879. They had various specific aims, of which we shall mention only one today. Between 1841 and 1879, the decision was to be taken as to whether a certain sum of spiritual wisdom could be brought to maturity in the spiritual world, so that from the final third of the 19th century onwards, it could gradually seep down to the earth and enter human souls and there stimulate spiritual knowledge. Knowledge of the kind that today we call the knowledge of spiritual science. Such knowledge has only become possible since the final third of the 19th century. The purpose of those angeloid spirits between 1841 and 1879 was to prevent the maturing over there in the spiritual world of what was supposed to seep down. You understand what this man is saying? There's a time where the veiling thins between these realms. And so this was a time that certain knowledge was supposed to come down to the planet. And there were efforts made, according to him, to prevent nefarious efforts, malefic efforts to prevent this energy from permeating the three-dimensional realm that would foster spiritual evolution, the spiritual evolution of humanity. This period that he's talking about would encompass the year 1843, just 2 years after when he says this starts. So again, we know for sure Rudolf Steiner was an astrologer. So just further evidence to show how important and pivotal this era was. And this is why, see, the people Joseph Smith knew, he's the founder of the Mormon church. He knew. William Miller knew, the founder of the Seventh-day Adventist church. These guys knew, but they did not teach as far as their followers. They did not teach them the inner chamber knowledge that they had. And I would suggest that maybe they were part of the movement to suppress this energy. But still, these people were all competing against each other at the same time. See, New York, there's an area in New York called the Burned Over District. I don't have the book over here, but if you get the book Occult America, it talks about this. This place in upstate New York where this is where the mystics would come and gather. And around this time, this was a real hotbed. And this is where these people were. Miller gets his, he makes his mark in the burned over district. Joseph Smith makes his mark before he moves and tries to travel out west. But this is the area. And it would appear that some of these guys may have been carrying out the mission that Steiner's talking about to prevent this spiritual evolution. Now, back to melanin. Here's some of the different names that it can be referred to as: occultum, melissa, honey, spice, apple, clockwork orange, real, the force, mashmack, Christ, chrism, chaos, Superman, Nephilim, the birds. And it makes you think about, what is Alfred Hitchcock really talking about with the birds? I want to read something from another book, The Black Sun. And I'm sorry, I don't have all of these books over here because it would be too much. But this is The Black Sun by Peter Moon. Here's a quote: occultum, which is Latin for hidden, acts as a superconductor between matter and the life force. Occultum is a bridge between the blueprint room and physical matter itself. Think about what I said earlier when I said, talking about Venus. I said Venus, through the powers of connectivity and conductivity, Venus allows spirit to commingle with the 3D world. And go back and listen to what Peter Moon is saying about occultum, showing the correlation between melanin and Venus. Occultum, which is Latin for hidden, acts as a superconductor between matter and the life force. Occultum is a bridge between the blueprint room, which would be spirit, and physical matter itself, 3D world. If you consider computer technology again, you will realize that there are always better and faster ways of storing and transferring data at lightning speed. The limits are only determined by the users and the designers. Occultum is no different. Its most spectacular use would be the complete rearrangement of a physical death or deformity, as occurred with Lazarus or the leper. What occurs is largely determined by the person who uses occultum or the principles thereof. Before I say anything further, I should add that one does not need occultum. Okay, if you don't listen to anything else, listen to this. Before I say anything further, I should add that one does not need occultum to do the above things. as a spiritual being, there are no absolute limitations as to what you can or cannot do. The principle at play here is that when one transcends the physical plane and is granted carte blanche, access to the blueprint room, one begins to manifest the occultum or white gold in one's physical body. He said, one does not need occultum to do the above things. Now substitute the word melanin in there. One does not need melanin to do the following things, the above things. And I got to hang my hat here and I got to say this and get on my soapbox for a minute. In the previous installment, I talked about how in 87, the Afrocentric community held the first Melanin conference. Now, at this time, there is a reclamation of pride, and it is channeled through so called Black people reassociating themselves with an African heritage that they believe to be their roots. And so all these different discoveries coming out and this substance called melanin, and so there's a pride that comes with it. What we all must understand is as we sit some 37 years in the future, we're too late to be sitting and thinking of melanin to be like, yay, you know, black man magic, black girl magic. My melanin's popping. Like I see all these t-shirts. That was 40 years ago. I'm sorry to say that was 40 years ago. You have to speed up and catch up fast. The man just said, you don't need to possess it to do these things. You just need to know how to control it. Do you understand what he's telling, what he's saying in these lines? That sitting around and celebrating your melanin means nothing. It means nothing to have a high powered car if you don't know how to maintain it. You know, to replace the engine in a Ferrari, I don't know, it might be $25,000. I'm just guessing. Maybe more, maybe 50. Put a new engine in a Ferrari. So if you don't know how to maintain that car, you don't know what gas to put in it, you got to have the lifestyle to be able to afford the maintenance of a Ferrari. You know, oil changes, I'm sure, ridiculous. So the car means nothing if you don't know how to use it. And then can you drive it? Okay, the car can go 200 miles an hour, but are you skilled enough to drive that car? Because if not, when you try to get over 140, 150, you're liable to kill yourself. We got to get to that point of understanding about melanin. Because as I go along, I'm going to show you it is not something to just, yay, sit around and celebrate. From the time the word was introduced into the lexicon, we are, how many years are we? We are 100, we are almost 200 years in the future from the secret doctrine. Quote, if the question is asked by Mr. Keeley, Secret Doctrine is by H.P. Blavatsky. If the question is asked by why Mr. Keeley was not allowed to pass a certain limit, the answer is easy, because that which he has unconsciously discovered is the terrible sidereal force known to and named by the Atlanteans, which would be the Lemurians, which would be the children of Mu, which would become Ma'ars, Moors, and by the Aryan Rishis in their Ashtarvidya, by a name that we do not like to give. It is the vril of Bulwer Lytton's coming race and the coming races of our mankind. The name vril may be a fiction. The force itself is a fact doubted as little in India as the existence itself of their rishis, since it is mentioned in all the secret works. It is this vibratory force which, when aimed at an army from an Agni Roth fixed on a flying vessel, a balloon, according to the instructions found in Ashtar Vidya, reduce to ashes 100,000 men and elephants as easily as it would a dead rat. It is allegorized in the Vishnu Purana, in the Ramayana and other works, in the fable about the sage Kapila, whose glance made a mountain of ashes of King Sagara's 60,000 sons, and which is explained in the esoteric works and referred to as the Kapalaksha, Kapila's eye. And it is this satanic force that our generations were to be allowed to add to their stock of anarchist baby toys known as melanite, dynamite clockworks, explosive oranges, flower baskets, and such innocent names. It is the destructive agency which, once in the hands of some modern Attila, for example, a bloodthirsty anarchist, would reduce Europe in a few days to its primitive, chaotic state, with no man left alive to tell the tale. Is this force to become the common property of all men alike? End quote. Listen to what she's saying. Is this force to become the common property of all men alike? You got to read between the lines. She's talking about ethnic cleansing. You got to think about where she comes from. She comes from some part of Russia or somewhere in there. And listen, is this force, she already said melanite. We just read that the guy who mentioned the word 1843, he terms it melanite. She said, is this force to become the common property of all men alike? In other words, if this thing gets in their blood, as in if melanin gets in blood and it spreads, it could eradicate Europe. This is the foundation for ethnic cleansing. 1855, Oxford's second reference to melanin describes a, quote, black pigment, melanin, that appears in the form of reddish brown molecules. Reddish brown molecules. And when I read that, it triggered this. This right here is, this book is called The Superman Files. This is a must have. You want to get this book. All types of stuff in here. So I want to point out some things in this book. Again, based on or inspired by where the dictionary says reddish brown molecules. And I want to talk about in this book Superman's first encounter with Lex Luthor. I mean, I love this book. The artwork is just immaculate. It's something. I mean, it's a great, just a keepsake to have. Read this. This is young Superboy. Ma bought me this book and said I should write stuff down in it. It seems like a waste of time to me, but she figures that with everything going on, it'd make me feel better. I'm not really sure what to talk about. Not that there's not a lot going on with me. I got sick today. That probably doesn't sound like a big deal, but it was for me. I can't remember the last time I felt even the slightest bit under the weather. Ma and Pa said I kept them up plenty of times when I was a baby, but when I think about it, it's hard for me to even remember feeling tired. I guess I took who I am for granted. I just started assuming that nothing could hurt me. Then the day happened and I hurt all over. And now I'm scared it's going to happen again. Everything started at the Lowell County Fair. I met this kid named Lex who was selling some of these old books he'd already read. He seemed nice enough. He kind of had a chip on his shoulder, but he didn't make fun of my new glasses or anything. I think he liked the fact that I liked to read. Anyway, we got to talking about aliens, the kind from outer space. I didn't mention to him about my situation or anything, but it was nice to talk to someone else who took this sort of thing seriously. Then all of a sudden, Gets this smile on his face, and he pulls out this glass jar from under the table. Inside it, there's this glowing green rock, but I didn't get much time to look at it or ask him what it was, because that's when the sickness started. It hit all at once. There was like a tightness in my stomach, and my legs just buckled underneath me. I've never felt that weak before. I felt lightheaded, like I was going to pass out or throw up or both at the same time, if that's even possible. I'm not sure exactly what happened next, but I think I actually did pass out for a split second and kind of fell on the table with all Lex's books and stuff. He started yelling at me, but I wasn't listening. I was just stumbling away. All I could think about was getting home, getting away and being alone with whatever this pain was I was feeling. After a few minutes, the sickness was almost gone. I started thinking that things were getting back to normal. Maybe it was just some sort of flu that my body, I don't know, process really fast or something. But I didn't have time to think about it because that's when the tornado hit and things got really crazy. So obviously Lex is holding some kryptonite. But when I read the symptoms, lightheaded, legs got weak, tightness, the pain, my mind, it's funny how these light bulbs come on and it just dropped in my head. They're describing a sickle cell crisis. You know, my uncle had sickle cell, and the pain and the tightness, and I looked up some of the symptoms of a sickle cell crisis, and many of them match up with what is being described in this book. They are talking about, they're describing the attributes of Superman, and they're giving clues as to what Superman represents, which is why I listed it as one of the words for melanin. But let's keep going, because here's another big clue: his uniform. So here is, it says, in an attempt to help her son embrace his heritage, Martha Kent sold a traditional Kryptonian. I could have given that as one of the names for melanin too. Krypton. Crypt is death. Melanin is crushed up death. Martha Kent sold a traditional Kryptonian outfit out of the blankets she had originally discovered him in. After 5 broken pairs of scissors, a destroyed sewing machine, and a damaged chainsaw, Martha finally enlisted the help of Clark's heat vision to finish the garment. But look at the swaths. Now look at that. Blue, yellow, red. They're giving clues. Remember, I was reading in the definition in Oxford Dictionary, second entry, 1855. Melanin appears in the form of reddish brown molecules. Well, what happens when you mix blue, yellow, and red, which are the primary colors? What do you get? You get brown. Put it right there in our faces. You get brown. They describe a sickle cell crisis, and then they show you what Superman really, what he represents. I want to say this before I continue. I want to read something. This is something that's supposed to be a personal note from Lex Luthor, because someone may be thinking, now this fool is on here trying to use a Superman book to as a teaching tool, like he's delusional. And I know there's somebody out there who thinks that way. I want to, and this is why you get things like this, because basic thinking people, common thinking people, will only look for knowledge where they are told to look for it. So that means you can put something in a book like this that will tell you everything, spell it out. But by the conditioning to where you don't even consider something like this, I learned this from the great Bobby Hemmett. By not even considering a source like this is how they can put it right in here, because we've already been conditioned to think this is just fairy tale. So this is a Lex Luthor personal note. He says, I'll skip down some. While it may take a few days to gain financial footing in Metropolis, The appearance of money is more important than the actual presence of money, given the game. And it is critical that I increase my worth while not tipping my hand to local competitors. Charity is important. It provides a blinding smokescreen to the public and automatically creates an aura of doubt surrounding any creative money making practices. Listen to this. No area is off limits. There is much knowledge to be gained from the study of fields considered fantasy or science fiction by the average citizen. There you go. They put it right here. They're letting you know. Not only are they giving you the nuggets, they're letting you know how things are hidden. And they're letting you know that the average citizen wouldn't even look at this stuff. It says, there is much knowledge to be gained from the study of fields considered fantasy or science fiction by the average citizen. Genius shouldn't be wasted on the mundane. There is less competition and more room for enormous profit when dealing with the bizarre. Right there in our faces. Okay. Now, I said melanin is crushed up death. All right. So, Superman's planet, Krypton, is going through chaos and it's about to be destroyed. And his father, Jor-El, builds a rocket to put him in to send him to Earth. So, because he's coming from a dying planet, Krypton, to Earth, and we're making the connection between Superman and melanin, melanin is crushed up death because it comes from another dimension and it's leaving that dimension represents death in another dimension. And then it comes here to this dimension. This says schematics for Jor-El's completed rocket ship. Now, what are they showing you? That's the pineal gland. That's the pineal gland. That's the rocket ship that transports melanin from another world into this one, all laid out right in front of our faces. So, continuing, melanin is a cosmic repository of knowledge, cosmic memory, akasha. If it is ignited and properly cultivated, it illuminates the pineal gland, which is what the rocket that carries Superman to Earth represents. Again, melanin, like copper, like Venus, is a conduit. It conducts energy and music. It's the conductor, as the latter creates a frequency that allows for spirit to be present on the earth plane. Now, again, we're going back to the 1840s. In the 1840s, choral singing and musical instruments were added to church services. See, I'm trying to show the correlatives because I just talked about melanin, copper, Venus, conductivity, the conductor, the director of the band, of the symphony. And then we see that for the first time, we have choral singing shows up in churches, musical instruments. It's everything that ties to an occult underpinning. These are forces that are moving behind the scenes that the average person is not aware of. As late as 1843, a weekly gathering in New Orleans place, Congo, drew hundreds of traditional African dances and dramas and thousands of spectators. 1843. During the same period, Frank Johnson and Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield are performing classical and opera music. The music is dealing with the muse in Greek mythology. And the muse, as in music, comes from the root men, and men, men, means mind. And this is where we get the Greek Mnemosyne, which is the patroness of memory. By Jupiter, she's the mother of the nine muses. So the muses, Mnemosyne, memory, cosmic memory. We're still talking about melanin. And I want to show you something because where did I read that? That the nine muses represent the arts. Okay. Venus, which ties back to Hathor. Hathor is bovine. The symbol for one of the signs Venus rules, Taurus, is a bovine. Venus, Taurus, is dealing with earth. And the word earth comes from ard, and ard reduces to art. The nine muses coinciding with Venus, back to Hathor, the great mother. She still shows her imprint. This is why we study language. Language, astrology, history. You can unpack all types of things and you'll see an archetype that is expressing and showing itself throughout time. She shows up in the language. She shows up in the mythology. She shows up in a people. She is what the reason so-called black people coincide with Venus is because these people, melanin, Venus, is feminine. To be so-called black is a feminine race of people. Thus the affinity for the music, the affinity for dance, the affinity for song, for fashion, for the expression of art. It's because it's the goddess who is present at all times. So there are countless scientific breakthroughs that occurred in the 1840s and 50s. And we're not going to unpack this, but I'm just going to throw this out. How was the West able to make such technological leaps and bounds? Sure, many of you have heard of the mud flood theory. What's her name? Michelle Gibson. Look into her work. You can find her on YouTube, Michelle Gibson. Now, I said this period between 1840, or Rudolf Steiner said this period between 1841 and 1879 was so pivotal. Well, I talked about the square between Saturn and Pluto, 1843, that would continue to, would eventually perfect. Well, a real big deal that occurred was 1856. In 1856, Jupiter and Neptune were conjunct in Pisces. They only meet up in Pisces every 166 years. And Neptune, god of the ocean, Jupiter, expansion. It expands water. So this, if there were dark forces at play who are using astrological timing, then, and if there are technologies available to induce flooding, then this would have been an opportune time to use it. And if you go back and look in the historical record, there are countless floods that are occurring around the world, but especially here in America, countless floods. Great flood in California. It's flooding everywhere. Flooding down here in Texas, floods everywhere. 1848, Arnold Berthold discovers testosterone. Many scientists were curious about the testicles, whether they contained vital juices and how they worked. Here's the reason I'm bringing this up, because we're still dealing with hidden processes. To be pondering these vital essences or juices means that the mind, the Western scientific mind, was trying to find some hidden substance that is moving and shaping reality in an underworld environment, Pluto, and they wanted control of it, Saturn. Thus, melanin comes up into the lexicon. And then there's this research into discovering testosterone. We're trying to find something that's hiding from us, and we need to have control over it. That's this compulsivity. I mean, this dude was doing crazy stuff with chicken, cutting off gonads and putting it on the back of the chicken, all types of crazy stuff. This is how he discovered testosterone. 1850, Clyde Bernard demonstrates glycogenic function of the liver. The liver manufactures and stores glycogen. The liver is considered by some occultists to be the desire body and is weighed at death to see if the person has overcome his or her animal nature. Along with the pancreas, the liver plays a key role in regulating blood sugar levels and the potential of developing diabetes. This is going to sound like a big stretch, but again, when I refer to this for generations, they will show you people who are born and who die during these particular generations, because they will have been key figures in this energetic cycle. So astrologically, we want to look at who is born in an energetic cycle. So in the cycle where there's somebody's mind who is thinking about what's going on inside of a chicken's nuts, you got to be a little crazy. But either way, The mind is thinking, what's going on in there? And this is how testosterone is discovered in the West. You have someone who is probing the liver to see what does it do? What's its function? And they discover the glycogenic cycle, which is processing sugar, basically. So at that same time, in that energy, a man named John Harvey Kellogg is born, who would co-found with his brother the Kellogg Processed Food Company. He's born in 1852. Now look at this. The food he initially produced was promoted as health food, but basically it's processed food and it had no actual health benefits. And the irony is that it would later help to increase the propensity of diabetes. So in the year 1850, there's a discovery about the liver, which has a key role in sugar production and the processes that could lead to diabetes if it's not functioning and in harmony with the pancreas. That same cycle, 2 years later, a man is born who would found a company that would play a major role in contributing to diabetes. In addition to that, this man organized the first national conference on race betterment held in 1913 at Battle Creek Sanitarium while Uranus is opposing Neptune. So he was basically a eugenicist. But what all is going on? What else is going on in the world? There's a little man who rises up with a movement named Noble Drew Ali. And if memory serves me correct, it's 1913 when he starts a movement called the Moorish Divine and National Movement in Newark, New Jersey. Same year. So you have these these conjunctions and these roads, these intersections. 1850, German physicist Rudolf Clausius formulates the second law of thermodynamics, entropy. The entropy or disorder of a closed system is always increasing. If a process generates entropy, it will happen spontaneously and will be irreversible unless you input more energy. Read this again. The entropy or disorder of a closed system is always increasing. If a process generates entropy, which is decay, it will happen spontaneously and will be irreversible unless you input more energy. This is the foundation for chaos magic. There must be some type of input or variable that is added, or else there will be a natural decay or entropy. Even from a standpoint, from a racial standpoint or a global standpoint, people say, okay, you talk about all these things that melanated people built and kingdoms and empires. And well, how did you lose it all? Because there needed to be a variable input to offset the natural entropy that was bound to occur. If you've been on the planet long enough to sit around and count 25,920 year cycles, then that's old. I've got some literature that suggests that ancient man goes back 230, 200, 300 million years, where they found metal that was perfectly etched out and that goes back millions of years. So there's a natural decay that happens. And so maybe there was a need to insert and allow a degree of chaos so that there could be a recovery process and that recovery process would take so long that it would stave off the natural entropy that would have happened. In other words, even all the things I talked about in the beginning about having to recover and how you're being written out of history, necessary. It was all necessary. Just the neuron activity I have to expend to put this together. It's a development process for me. Then hopefully if you're edified by any of this, it's a development and neuron stimulating process for you. Neurons, axioms firing as you're thinking, trying to figure out, follow like what is he saying and put all this together and try to connect the dots with me. It's creating new pathways in the brain. And if we always had that information and knowledge that we had in the beginning, that would have been natural entropy. because it would have been a closed system. And melanin needs a struggle for it to evolve and grow. It needs resistance. So this energy I'm describing, 1843 up to late 1850s, is leading up to the Civil War and what afterwards would be labeled as Reconstruction. However, we were never taught that what the latter really meant. It appears that history was reconstructed and that a new timeline was created. I want to read something from another unlikely source. This is Nephilim, occult role playing. Again, got to get honors to the brother Bobby Hemmett because this is where I found out about this book. So I want to read a little something here. Among the first great secrets that a Nephilim learns is that history, as conceived by the majority of humans, is incorrect. Most, perhaps all, historical events have their origins in the magical world of the Nephilim. Human history books only describe the surface of things as lived by individuals and groups who are unable to comprehend their true implications or simply refuse to face the truth. Furthermore, secret societies have fabricated false historical and scientific truths to protect their influences and activities. These deceptions have been accepted as truth by most of humanity. A blatant example of this, a blatant example is that Darwin's theory of natural selection. Incurably curious, Darwin discovered Atlantean documents which hinted at the origins of human development. During one of his numerous travels, he was eventually initiated into a secret Masonic lodge which aimed at bringing humans and Nephilim together. When he learned the origins of humanity and the destiny of the Nephilim, Darwin destroyed the observations which had brought him to his enlightenment, afraid of betraying the Nephilim Lodge to the other hostile secret societies. Then, guided by Nephilim, Darwin built his coherent system of biological evolution to further obscure the track. This also provided a weapon which would be used to attack the Masons' sworn enemy, the Catholic Church. Thus, Darwin protected those whom he called the miracle of selection, the Nephilim. Each Nephilim knows the story of its origin, for it has learned it during its various incarnations, step by step. Bits are inscribed on obscure papyri or engraved on stone tablets in forgotten languages. Centuries of war have destroyed vast sources of ancient knowledge. This fragmentation of history makes it hard for them to compile the truth properly. We have selected the version given below because it is the most complete, concise, and modern. This is in a role playing book. This is not talking about go and get your sword and get your shield. And no, they are dropping. And then it comes in here the cycle of Mu. Mu, remember, Mu, Lemuria, Atlanteans, Mu, more. They develop mystical tools so that their thoughts, sharpened by the field of the moon, replace both speech and tools. So just giving this factoids about the cycle of Mu, children of Mu, Nephilim. They did everything which they could imagine until at last they waged interminable wars on each other for entertainment. But they were not omniscient. Their vast years of rule, the manageable power of the moon fields, and their dedication to material pleasure conspired to blind them. New life forms had evolved at their expense. The rays of the sun continued their slow process upon these new life forms, which would much later give birth to human beings. Very interesting stuff. Again, this is why we must keep our eyes open and don't turn your back on anything. Everything is fair game when it comes to gaining knowledge. Now, I've jumped through a whole lot of areas here. And I'm going to try to start summing this up. I got about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points that I'm going to elaborate on to conclude. So if you've made it this far in the video, shout out to you. You are a real one. You obviously are hungry for knowledge, and I appreciate you because I know I've been all over the place, but there is a through line running through here. I hope you're following me. So first point of conclusion, melanin is a cosmic magnet, i.e. Venus, the goddess Ma'at, is associated with the scales of justice, which coincides with the Libra scales. This also suggests the act of balancing and relating. The word relate comes from the root TOL, which reduces to TL, the letters T and L, which relates to the word Atlas. Now, what's interesting is just as I'm putting this together, I go on Netflix, and there's a series, a movie that pops up on Netflix with Jennifer Lopez called Atlas, and her name in the movie is Atlas Shepherd. You can't make this stuff up. So I'm going to finish my breakdown, and we'll come back to that. So TL, which relates to the word Atlas, ATLS. From this, we get the ancient city of Atlantis. Now, point two books, Atomic Christ and Blue Apples. I didn't bring the other one, but these books are by a guy named William Henry. They're hard to find now. I got these almost like 10 years ago, but these books they're hard to get a hand on now. Atomic Christ and Blue Apples reference the term Tula, which is TULA, which reduces to TLA, or you can reverse it. Wouldn't it just be easier if I go to the whiteboard? Let's go to the whiteboard. As I said the word relate comes from this root, TOL, which reduces to TL. Because when we're transliterating words, we look more at the shell, which is the consonants. Now, this relates to the word atlas. And you'll see in there we have, okay, pay attention to those. Now, in the Atomic Christ, he represents the word Tula, and Tula reduces to TLA, which can be reversed, the anagram of which would be ATL, Atlanta, Atlantis. With the vowel removed, we still end up with TL, like over here. Tula was called Ultimate Thule by the Druids. The Buddhists called their peacemakers or teachers Tulkas. Jesus was born to a Bethula, the Hebrew word for virgin. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, which is the vessel of Tula. In Blue Apples, Thule is another name for Tula and derives from the Greek word tolos. Tolos means black earth. Black earth would be another word for black Adam, because Adamai means earth. Black earth would also be black Amor, because Mor is another word for land, i.e. earth. Black earth is also another name of Egypt, Kim, the black land. The Greeks called the Milky Way's central sun Tula, which is balance in Sanskrit. Remember, we started with looking at the Libra scales and the word balance and relationship, and it led to toll as NTL. So we've already come full circle, because the Greek word for the Milky Way central sun, Tula, means balance in Sanskrit. In the mystical book, the Bahir, the word Tela is utilized, which means to hang. Then Teli from Tela is the name of the connecting link that will enable our soul to return to its home, Jacob's ladder. Atlas, definition, he dares or suffers. That's the definition from Robert Graves. As the earth bearer or scales, the vulture, the ravisher, life and death is in actuality melanin. So here's what Crawley has to say in Libra 51, The Lost Continent, about Atlas. Atlas is the true name of the archipelago. Continent is an altogether false term, for every house or mountain peak has cut from its fellows by natural, was cut from its fellows by natural, though often very narrow waterways. The African Atlas is a mere offshoot of the range. It was the true Atlas that supported the ancient world by its moral and magical strength, and hence the name of the fabled globe bearer. The root is the Lemurian TLA or TLAS, black, for reasons which will appear in due course. A is the feminine prefix derived from the shape of the mouth when uttering the sound. Black woman is therefore as near a translation as one can give in English. The Latin as endeared of the Virgin L and the serpent S, Theos, root O, first written 0, means the sun in his strength, and also the lingam yoni conjoined. So he gives the basic blueprint for Atlas and how it ties back to through. He basically says black woman, feminine power, goddess, womb, melanin, Venus, great mother, Hathor, copper, conductor, conductivity. This brings it all together. Now, William Henry sent me on a wild goose chase with a statement made about Marika in his book Atomic Christ. He said, the first category of secrets is a means to establish a social order, a kingdom of heaven on earth based on spiritual principles. Interestingly, at the end time, said the Essene Dead Sea Scrolls, the star or light to the west called Marika would shine. I went to the back of his book. I said, I got to find where he got this from. He gave his source as Bloodline of the Holy Grail. I went and got 3 of those books because I found out it had different copyright dates. I got at least two or three of them nowhere to be found. Sent me on a wild goose chase. And I was so frustrated because I felt like that was the last piece of the puzzle that I needed when I was putting all this stuff together. This was like probably 7, 8 years ago when I was tracking this stuff down. Maybe 3 years ago or so, something fell in my lap. I'm online looking around and I stumble across an article, and I want to give this lady. The article is Thalia, obscure goddess Thalia Took. Yeah, it says, please credit the work to Thalia Took. So I want to give this person their just due. Thalia, Thalia, Took, Took. Look at this. Dia Marika. Let me read some of this. Dia Marika is the goddess of the Liris River, a slow-moving river that meanders through Latium, central Italy, and the goddess of swamps and wildlife associated with it. Skip down. The name Dia Marika is a descriptive title, not a proper name, meaning goddess of the salt marshes in the Volscian language, which is related to Oscan and is a word from the Arunci. So, some more information. In Roman legend, Dia Marika was the wife, sometimes mother, of the goddess Faunus, an oracular forest god who was equated with the Greek Pan. She was the mother of King Latinus, whose daughter was Lavinia, wife of Aeneas. And so Dea Marica could be considered an ancestress of the Latin and therefore Roman people. Perhaps this is part of why she was associated with the goddess Venus, the mother of Aeneas, whose descendants were to found Rome. Though there she was also some confusion in imperial times between Venus's epithet Marina of the sea and the similarly spelled Marica. Latinus has ties to Jupiter and may have been an incarnation or epithet of his. This could indicate that Dea Marica, as mother of Latinus, was locally considered an important mother goddess. These associations would make Dea Marica a goddess of enchantment, spellcraft, and transformation, as well as goddess of the wild woods and salt marshes and its abundant wildlife. Also called Maricas, Marica. She was associated with Venus or Aphrodite, Kirk, Circe, and Angedia. Now, this is a technical aspects of wetlands, history of wetlands in the conterminous United States, early 1600s to 1800, colonial settlement. As the time of European settlement in the early 1600s, the area that was to become the conterminous United States had approximately 221 million acres of wetlands. About 103 million acres remain as of the mid 1980s. Why am I bringing this up? And I got a lot of stuff in here I highlighted because it shows that this was swampland, wetlands. Marika is the goddess of salt marshes and swamps. We know that America is Alamarak, etymologically. Marak, Marika. Marika ties back to Venus. Venus coincides with melanin. The word melanin first appears in 1843. In 1843, Pluto is in Aries, which means one thing I didn't mention that is key: concealment of identity. Pluto in Aries. Identity, true identity, hidden. Pluto in Aries. Squaring, Saturn. Possible nefarious means to control through concealing the truth, true identity. Astrology is Moorish science. And I'm not talking about, we're talking about the science, not the civics. And I'm not negating the civics, but what I'm talking about, the science. That is what's bothersome about the conversation about astrology. It is the birthright of the people being described in all of this presentation to know and study astrology. It's your birthright. And to be left out of the conversation is a travesty because what is being laid out here is Moorish history. It's world history. And it's a rediscovery of an identity that was hidden, suppressed at that time. This is not intended to make you feel good about yourself. We're far beyond that point now. That was 1987. Now you must learn how to access, harness, and cultivate this power that we've been discussing. Otherwise, it can be just as destructive as it can be helpful. The same thing that gave Superman his power is what weakened him. That's why it's too late to be talking about my melanin is popping. It Those are just empty statements. When it's really popping, you're not telling anybody, you're living it. And as Peter Moon said in his book, if you don't use it, someone who's skilled can use it and steer you remotely. When Jupiter conjoined Saturn on December 20th through 23rd, 2020, a key doorway opened. The problem is many people were looking for some type of Hollywood movie production type of realization. They were looking for something magical just to show up. All the most powerful things happen in the subtle manner and subtle realms. That's the trick. We've been conditioned to look for things to be explosive and attention getting. That's not where the real magic happens. It happens in the subtle, it happens in the unseen. Another major portal opened around April 10th through 16th, 2022, with Jupiter conjoining Neptune in Pisces, a configuration they had not formed since 1856. And 1855 is when we have the second usage of the term melanin, referring to brownish red molecules. So, in that energy field of Jupiter and Neptune conjoining in 1856, melanin is introduced in that vein. In 2022, the same configuration happened. Same planets, same sign. That was a doorway. The last time they conjoined was in 1856. The eclipse on April 8th, 2024 was another doorway. But remember the Superman story. His powers tormented him until he learned how to use them properly, which requires discipline, focus, determination, imagination, experimentation, and experience. Again, if I reference the Black Sun, quote, "What occurs is largely determined by the person who uses occultum or the principles thereof. Before I say anything further, I should add that one does not need occultum to do the above things. As a spiritual being, there are no absolute limitations as to what you can or cannot do. The principle at play here is that when one transcends the physical plane and is granted carte blanche access to the blueprint room, one begins to manifest the occultum or white gold in one's physical body." End quote. The magic of Venus and melanin is available. If you don't use it, somebody else will. Private readings, I'm available through my website, 720astrology.com. Know the stars to know yourself. Peace.